Welcome to UCF Imprint. I'm Alice Collier. Whether you're a student or faculty member, you've probably had dozens of teachers in your lifetime. Now let me ask you this. How many of those teachers do you actually remember as being exceptionally good? Well, if you're like me, only a fraction of them were what you might call outstanding. So what are those qualities that combine to create an excellent, memorable teacher? And why do some teachers inspire students to work 3 times harder than they normally would, while others inspire students to skip class? Joining me is UCF Associate Professor in the College of Education, Dr. Lisa Dieker. She has written a well-respected lesson plan on co-teaching. Welcome, Lisa. What makes a good teacher?
Well, great question. I think a great teacher is a great teacher, whether it's a child with a disability, a normal child, a gifted child, but some characteristics you would see. I like to say they're in thirds. A third of that teacher would be a person who loves learning themselves, so they're constantly seeking to update their knowledge and what they need to know. The other is there's this love of children, but that's really not enough. It's funny, I interviewed student teachers or prospective candidates, and they'll go, oh, I love children. I'm like, okay, that'll get you through the first week. And then what do we do from there?
You won't love them so much.
Exactly. So loving is great, but really it's more of that wanting to know that child, have empathy for that child, understand their disability if there is one, understand if they're gifted, where they're going, if they're average, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses. And then the other part I think is high expectations, and I think that's critical in a special education teacher, that they look at that child and go, okay, you might have some challenges, but I'm going to set the bar up here, and I'm going to help you get there, and I'm going to know and I'm going to learn about your disability so that I can understand it, but I'm going to make sure you reach that high goal. So if you could have that, it would be a perfect world.
Yeah.
But again, that's, not everybody has all those traits, and I think when people recognize what they do have, if I have a great love for children and then I choose to learn about disabilities or how to raise my expectations, I think a lot of people can be great teachers, and some people just innately are.
Did you have a great teacher?
I did. My second grade teacher, Mary Queener, I think it's because she was so supportive. I was having some rough times in life, and she was wonderful to be there, played the piano, sang to us, read, all those things that you just remember. I still remember the songs, the activities in class, so I'm sure you had the same.
Oh yeah, my first grade teacher.
Really?
Yeah, who told me I could do anything.
Yeah,
and those are the teachers we tend to just migrate towards.
Right, exactly.
Now tell me, when did you first realize that you wanted to be a teacher, that was something that you liked to do?
Well, it was a blessing. A very, very young age, I was probably 3 when I started saying I want to teach children, and I originally thought I wanted to work with children who were blind and deaf, and that changed over time, but I always knew I wanted to be a special education teacher. My brother, at about the age of 8, actually 10, I was 8, got struck with an illness that caused some very, very serious issues. He even had to go all the way to an institution and be institutionalized. And I thought going to the institution was a fun activity because I got to hang out with other children with disabilities. So in some ways it was a blessing. The happy end of that story, I have to tell you, is because of my parents, because of great teachers. My brother overcame a lot of that, is now like the Associate Director of Finance in the City of Phoenix.
Oh my.
And really and truly, our family believes it's because of great teachers. So it's something that's been a part of my life forever, and it just seems normal to me to be around people that have unique challenges and say, let's keep that expectation high.
What a great accomplishment for your family.
Yeah, my parents are amazing, amazing people. My brother and I both, I have a PhD, he has all of his coursework for a PhD. My parents didn't go to college, and yet they told us all along. So I really think it's a balance. You can have great teachers without families, or you can have great families without great teachers, and it's really hard for children to move forward without both.
So where do you think you got this passion from? Was it just growing up with your brother?
I think so, and then it continues. I'm married. My husband has a sibling with a disability. Our child has an identified disability, and I just think it's been a part of my world, and that passion will probably never go away, because I see when society deals with people, not disabilities, and they go, this child needs this. Children can do anything. I saw it in my own teaching. I see it every day in classrooms, whether it's a special ed teacher, a general ed teacher, whether it's the person working with somebody at 7-Eleven. If they're willing to look at that person, that person can accomplish anything.
Well, what is special ed? Because it runs the gamut, doesn't it? There's a variety of disabilities.
Yeah, And we could be here all day talking
Yeah,
about all the
yeah.
disabilities, but basically I like to kind of say there's usually 3 to 4 types of disabilities most commonly. Kids who have normal intelligence or above. So a child with a disability can be smarter than you and I, can have IQs in the gifted range and have maybe an inability to learn like everyone else, or an inability to behave like everyone else, or they could have physical challenges in some way or sensory challenges. The other group of children that we often see are kids with lower cognitive functioning, kids who, when we test them and give them IQ, we believe that they don't function intellectually like everyone else. Now that's a whole another topic, because many times testing is biased. Testing is created by an educated upper middle class culture that sometimes when we test children from different backgrounds, different socioeconomic status, they tend to be over-identified. But children who have lower cognitive functioning normally also have issues of adapting in society. They don't kind of understand the social norms the way you and I do. And again, they need a different level of education, not only academics, but they need to be taught how to get along, how to stay safe, how to greet people to get a job, how to say, you know, hello, welcome. My favorite is the young man who we worked forever on greeting, because his goal in middle school was to greet people appropriately. He'd walk up to you and say, oh, hi, and he'd hug you. And I'm like, you know, that's fine, but now that you're 15, that begins to be socially inappropriate. So I taught him, when you meet somebody, you need to have an arm distance. And so then he began to come up and go, hi, how are you? And I was like, not quite what I meant.
He took you literally.
He did. And again, that is a part of that area of a disability, is that sometimes that littleness is there. And so those are the most common areas we would see in special education. Many a times, a more popular one that we're hearing more about is attention deficit and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. However, that one isn't federally used in the definition for Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, but often those children are served under other health impairments. They may end up having learning issues from that, but the definition of ADHD is not currently supported under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education.
I didn't know that, because it seems so popular.
Well, it doesn't mean that it's not an issue and that kids can't get services, but again, there's not a formal federal definition for that like there is for a learning disability. Like we have a definition, even though it's very vague, this is what it means to have a learning disability.
Now tell me this, you developed this lesson plan for special education programs. Tell me about this.
Well, it's actually for both general ed and special ed. The new movement with children with disabilities is to include them, and I'm a very passionate
include them how?
Into the general education setting.
Okay,
And
because traditionally they've been separated?
Right. And I was going to use my own brother as an example there. His illness was prior to the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act even passing. So by law, no one ever had to serve him. But he was served in the institution when he became so aggressive and violent. He got the flu, which we believe saved his life. He ran a fever of 106 degrees, and we think that killed the original virus that he got.
Oh my.
And so basically that's a miracle. But as he was coming back, there was no special services. It was either in an institution, live with your parents, and this was in 1974, or you go to public school with no support. And because of a wonderful new teacher in a small public school, she said, sure, he can come back to school and try. Now, I don't know of another child in this country that people would have said that today, because we have so many ways to segregate kids. And yet, because there was no other option, he was allowed to go back in the general ed setting. So he was in the regular classroom with all of his other peers in 7th grade, just like everybody else, and the expectations were here. You will learn to behave, you will learn to be like as much as possible.
Is that what we used to refer to when I was a kid as mainstreaming?
Well, there's two trends. Mainstreaming was really a trend that started in the 80s, and our Secretary of Ed said not enough kids with disabilities are in the regular classroom. The problem with mainstreaming versus the concept I like, and my book is focused more on inclusion, is if I'm a child with a learning disability and I work hard enough in math, you'll let me earn the way to go into the math class. And you look at that, and I always use an activity with teachers. I say, if I were to give you $20, you would take it, right? They're like, sure.
Yeah.
But if I were to give you a kid with a learning disability, would you say the same thing? And they're like, And so what mainstreaming did is it said kids with learning disabilities are $10 bills. And if you're good enough in math, we'll let you earn your way back into math class. In the 90s, parents of kids with disabilities came up with this movement of inclusion, and parents of kids with disabilities have changed the world for children with disabilities. They deserve 100% of the credit. Professionals, being one myself, I know I don't have as nearly the influence as parents have had on moving these children forward. But they said kids with disabilities shouldn't have to earn their way in the classroom. They should be there to start with. And yet we have these laws that as parents, I can say child belongs here, but if I think that my child needs more reading, my child needs more social skills, my child feels unsafe, it's too stressful, by law I can move my child away into more self-contained settings, all the way even to an institution, if we as a educational group, parents, agree that's the best thing. One of the problems we've had in this country is that once we move kids away, we forget to bring them back. So an interesting question I always ask is, what happens when you graduate from high school? Have you ever seen a McDonald's that says, oh, kids with learning disabilities and behavior disorders are only allowed to eat and work here? No. When kids graduate, they have to live next door to people without disabilities. They have to work beside those people. So kids need that opportunity. And so this book is saying, general ed teacher, kid's going to be there. It's not fair to put that child there without some support. So if that child is going to come in your classroom in this lesson planning book, you plan your lessons the way you always do, but let me show you modifications for that specific child in your classroom. So if the kid's in your room and they can't read like everybody else, and you tomorrow are going to teach a lesson on reading, let me show you some modifications, some technology, some strategies that will help that child feel good. And yet that's not your job. As a general ed teacher, their job's overwhelming. They have 30 kids in the room.
Yeah, I was going to say, what about the other students in the class?
Right, right. And so in my work with co-teaching, you're the general ed teacher, I'm the special ed teacher. I come into the room and provide you support. I come in and show you what to do, or vice versa, you show me the content knowledge, because not only is that unfair to you in some ways, but it's unfair to me. How do I learn, as a great special ed teacher that wants to do the best job, how do I learn high school algebra, trigonometry, chemistry, math, science, social studies, and provide support to 25 kids who have varying disabilities across all those areas? Well, you as the general ed teacher have that knowledge. Let me come in and give you that one-on-one support for that kid who needs it. Let me show you that child's learning needs. You help me understand the high content.
And this is different than having a child tutor.
Correct, very different. My role is not in there to tutor. My role is in there to be the special. It's what's special about special education. And instead of me taking you down the hall and teaching you this information, I'm now doing it, not singling you out, but I'm doing it in a way that enriches the lesson so that that child who has a disability is learning. But guess what? When it's done well, it's good for every kid in the class.
Give me an example that you've had.
I've had multiple experiences. I had the privilege when I was in Milwaukee for a year to watch the 10 best co-taught teams in the city of Milwaukee. They were nominated. Milwaukee Public Schools has over 10,000 teachers, so there was a big playground there. I watched a high school chemistry class that I think is the one that blew me away for the rest of my life. In this classroom were 6 children with autism, fully included. This was several years ago, and it was very much out of the box thinking to say these kids would be in there. Yet autism is a spectrum disorder. Kids with autism may be advanced in any skill of any child in the classroom, to having lots of struggles. These 6 kids that were in there, 2 were in there for what I would call social skills. They were really in there to learn how to be in groups and work with others. 2 kids were in there what I would call 50-50. 50% of the time was social skills. The other was we had expectations for them to learn chemistry. The last 2 students were in there getting some of the best grades in chemistry. Bright, could handle chemistry like no one else. And in that classroom, the special ed teacher said, I don't have the background in chemistry. She said, if you saw my college transcripts, I should be arrested.
You would know.
Yes, I should not be teaching chemistry. So she went in and provided social skills support as needed, especially to the 2 students. One tended to scream sometimes, and you go, well, that kid would disrupt learning. Well, in this model, if he was disrupting learning, she could pull him aside, she could give him a more meaningful activity, she could deal with that, and yet still be in there to support the other 5 kids that had disabilities as needed. Then what happened is, over time, these kids got skills I watched one young man who'd never, ever made physical contact. And in this classroom, these kids were doing a lab making gook. I don't know if you've ever done that with your kids, but it's a slimy kind of a like Play-Doh. And one of the kids said, "Hey, will you hold this?" And he did. And we were like going, wow. For years, that's been a goal for him. It became more and more natural for him to touch things, be a part of the classroom. But the really cool part of that, Alice, was at the end, I talked to the kids. And there were this young man who was considered the brightest of the bright. And I said, "You're in chemistry, you have these kids included, are you learning any less?" And he said, "No, ma'am, I'm learning more." I'm like, "You learn more chemistry?" And he said, "No, ma'am, I'm a senior. I'm about to graduate." He said, "I'm probably going to be valedictorian. And I was going to graduate frightened of people with autism."
Wow.
And I went, okay, where's that on our state test? You know, where is that being measured? That he's not only learning about chemistry, he said, "I learned just as much about chemistry, maybe more because there were more people to help me." But he said, "I also learned about people with autism." He said, "I lived next door to one of these kids and never met him until this class."
So what did you personally learn from that experience?
Oh, well, I learned so much about the role of the special ed teacher. I learned that yes, at times I should be a chemistry teacher. I have a great background in science. Maybe I could be in a co-teaching, team teaching situation. In some cases, depending on the needs of the kids or the content area, it's okay for me to be in there providing support as long as kids are learning. And that's really the bottom line. And so again, when people argue with me about the concept of inclusion or co-teaching, I say, well, you know, I agree with you that it's not right if children aren't learning. And I have two simple questions I ask in the book. If it's good for all kids, then it's a good thing. If it's good for both teachers, it's a good thing. If this kid included in there, you question that no one else is learning, then I think you have to step back from that and say, are we providing the right supports? Is that kid getting what they need? Do we have this set up in a way that's going to be successful for both?
Do you find that most general education teachers want to embrace this concept?
Yes and no. Great teachers, absolutely. and
That's honest.
It is. There, you know, and teaching is the most difficult profession in this country. There's just not a harder job. I talk about here, you know, teachers make over 1,300 decisions a day.
Oh my.
And I jokingly say, you know, 10 cents
That's
a decision after
being
taxes.
A mother.
Right, it is right up there. Only a mother of 30.
Yeah.
You know, I have to decide, do I call on this kid? Do I not? Do I address this kid's need? Do I let that one go? I mean, the decision making is huge. And so to add a child with special needs, I understand why those teachers go, I can't do it. And again, I agree they shouldn't do it in some instances without support. A lot of kids with great teaching, my son's teacher is a great example. You know, she has multiple children in the classroom with varying needs, and I just know that from being in the classroom, and I'm in there quite often. Her classroom is so great, it doesn't matter if the kid has an IQ of 150, the kid has a disability, because she's a great teacher. And I think that's what we need to see more of, is great teachers who aren't afraid to ask someone else to come in their room, to let somebody else be a part of the classroom, and to support all kids. But yes, some teachers say, and usually I find it's more fear than unwillingness. I don't understand.
Fear of what?
Let's say Tourette's. I don't understand what Tourette's syndrome is, so I'm afraid if this kid comes in there, they're going to cuss me out. Well, less than 10% of kids with Tourette's end up with a part of that disability of using profanity. Some kids do. But again, if you understand the nature of that disability, you go, okay, well, if a verbal episode happens, the kid just needs to take a little break. You know, needs to walk away. I need to lower the stress. Or if a kid has a learning disability and can't do math like everybody else, well, maybe they need a calculator. I like to say kids with true learning disabilities need what I call a wheelchair for their brain. Just like you'd let a person be wheeled into a classroom and you wouldn't say, please, honey, get out of your chair and walk. You just wouldn't, I mean, that would be silly. Children with learning problems or need the same thing. They need a wheelchair for their brain. Teachers, too many times, parents, too many times look at those kids and say, if you just try harder, I know you can write. Well, if they truly have a disability in the writing area, it isn't going to happen. Just like a child, and not that you don't keep working on it, just like a child with a physical disability, you keep working on muscle tone, you keep seeking new interventions, you keep finding ways to help them, but it's not, you can't cure that. You have to say, okay, well, if you can't write, let me give you a laptop. Let me give you an Alpha Smart, which is a small mini computer. Let me help you find a way to write so that you can learn like everyone else. It's just you may not write like everyone else. else. And that's the fine line.
Have you had a teacher that's been on the fence about whether she or he wanted to try this, and you were able to convince them it was the right thing to do?
Absolutely. When I started, I actually wrote my master's thesis on collaboration, and I took my first job in a district where there hadn't been many new hires. So I'm the new eager teacher going, we can't wait to be in this building. I was thrilled to be there, and senior teachers. And so I really started with one teacher. One teacher, Steve Ogle, I'll never forget, who said, hey kids, you can come in my room and let's try this. It worked so well with him, he saw it. I said, will you be the ambassador? So when I find a teacher on the fence, A, I either work around that teacher and find somebody else that'll work with me, or B, I ask another general ed colleague, can you go and talk about the positives? Because again, it sounds self-serving. I'm the special ed. Of course I want those kids in that classroom. Of course I want to be in there. But when another general ed teacher says, come in and look, I always say lead by example. Come watch what we're doing. What about that makes you nervous? What don't you understand? What? And yet some people I went in and co-taught with and said, this isn't a good situation. I'm going to let the kids stay. I'll provide support. I'll give you suggestions, but I may physically not be there to provide that support. Is that okay? And I've had teachers say to me, I would prefer that.
Here's a thought, Lisa. What about the children? What do the other children think? You know, because peer pressure is huge about having this special ed teacher come into a class with a general education teacher and collaborate.
Right.
What do kids think about that?
Well, when it's done well, and you have two great teachers, okay, so again, now we're doubling this. We could have two bad teachers doing this, which we don't have many of those, but again, that could be an issue. Two great teachers, when we come in, you wouldn't know who was who. I would not go in there and individually single out the kid. I call it the mother hen syndrome, you know, that I wouldn't go in and go, are you okay, are you okay, are you okay? I would look around the class and say, is everybody okay? And when that child's needs aren't being met, I might add a concept into the lesson that's being taught. And I might say, oh, by the way, can I add this into the lesson, knowing it's for that child, but really it'll help all the kids in the classroom. I might take a small group of kids out and ask them if it's okay to take them out, but it might not just be kids with disabilities. It might be anybody who doesn't get the math concept that day.
I see.
And so when it's an art, it's really an art, not a science. When it's done well, kids even go, I don't know why there are two here, but I like it.
Okay.
And the kid with a disability may know, and the kid with a disability may say, thank you for being here, I want to be singled out. But again, when it's done well, you would see more of that seamless kind of interaction between the two teachers.
Because kids are real self-conscious.
Oh, absolutely. And equally self-conscious about going down the hall to a special room where everybody else has a disability. Because then they have to go, why are you leaving the classroom? And again, down the hall with that special teacher is doing phenomenal work with that child. But again, when appropriate, can that work be brought into the classroom that they're doing with that child? Because there's lots of kids who get tested every year, their parents are struggling, and they don't qualify for any help. And under this model, I'm able to help kids I might not be able to help otherwise.
Yeah, because kids don't want to be pulled out
Absolutely.
of class.
No, you know, and yet some do. Some say, please, if I'm a high school kid who can't read, don't teach me first grade reading in the middle of a high school classroom. Pull me out to teach me reading.
So how do you organize, Lisa, these teachers in a classroom? With your lesson plan, I know, but how do you go about doing it?
Well, there are 5 ways that are accepted in the literature, and it would vary depending on the lesson and the kids' needs. I always say, teachers say, well, I'm going to do this model this year, and I'm like, well, you can think you're going to do that model, but you may get a new kid who has needs that may change the model. But there are 5 ways. So one might be, you lead the lesson, I support you. Another way might be, you take half the class.
So one's kind of the leader, the other's like the
support person.
Okay.
And we could switch back and forth. It might be, I'm going to lead some strategy piece, you're going to lead the content knowledge. And that doesn't have to be the same every day, but it could. It could be, you lead forever and I support forever. In another model, we might have 2 stations. You might take half the kids and work on 2-digit division with paper pencil. I would have a half the class and be doing 2-digit division with real life problems. And the next day or the next period, the kids might switch. And you might say, well, why would we do that? Well, splitting the kids puts a lower number. And let's say if we had a room of 100 people here and I asked for a participant, very few people would raise their hands.
Sure.
But if I had 3 people here and they had a question, their likelihood of raising their hand goes up. So putting kids in smaller groups, breaking down the task a little more can be really helpful, especially for kids with disabilities. The third way we might work together, half the class, you teach the whole lesson, half the class, I teach the whole lesson. Why again? Smaller groups, real difficult concept. We want to make sure we can get to this, you know, if we have 30 kids now, I only have 15 that I'm watching, trying to make sure they get the concept and breaking it down. Probably my favorite, probably the one least utilized, but one of my favorites is alternative teaching. We have the whole class, I'm maybe supporting, and I walk around and I go, oh, there are 5 kids don't get it. I then take those 5 kids aside and reteach them. Or what I love to do when I can is have a study period with kids and I pre-teach them. So before they go in the classroom, these kids who normally struggle are going, I know the answer, I've got the right answer. And they
what
feel,
a boost in self-esteem too.
And it's huge. So you can see, but I can't do that if I don't know what the general ed teacher is teaching to start with. So in this planning book, the general ed teacher shares what they're teaching. I share the accommodations. When I go down the hall, I'm working with the kids on the lesson in advance. They go into the classroom and all of a sudden they go, I know more than everybody else here. And they feel great about themselves, and you see the spiral up curriculum. The last one is the one that teachers seem to want to do, but it's a struggle, and that's team teaching. And that's where I say you say devise, or I say is. We finish each other's sentences because we have time to plan together. We know each other, and we see this as a mutually beneficial outcome. That may not be the case for some people. Some people may not want me to be an equal to them. They may not want to take the time to plan together. They may not have the time, which is the case in many of our schools.
It takes a good team.
It does, and it develops over time.
Now, how does it feel your lesson plan is being used in schools throughout the country, but specifically in the Orlando area at Discovery Middle School? How does it feel to walk in and see the teachers following your plan?
Well, I think it's exciting, and it's really not my plan. It's kind of a joke in my home. It's a book of boxes. I mean, it's blank, and which I think is exciting.
Like a calendar.
It is. It's like, but that's what.
This is what she's talking about.
Yeah,
here.
and that's what, when I started teaching, that's what the general ed teacher used, and I had to go into their classroom and visit their lesson plan. Now think about that concept just to start with. If we're going to be equals in the classroom, and I have to go visit what I'm teaching, it doesn't make sense. And what you have here then is this is where the general ed teacher would fill it out. And then on the flip side is where the special ed teacher writes in the accommodation. So it's very exciting to go into places and say, it's not really my work that's there, it's those wonderful teachers' work that embrace a model and say, I get this model. I get that the general ed teacher needs to plan in advance so that I can make sure I'm meeting the needs of kids with disabilities in that general education setting.
Being organized.
Being organized, being a team. I mean, because if we both agree to fill out both sides of that book, we have agreed to work together as a team for these kids.
Well, Lisa, I'm afraid that will have to be the last word. It's exciting to know that you're teaching young teachers this information. Thank you for being a part of our program. Again, her workbook is called The Co-Teaching Lesson Plan. That's our program for now. Thanks so much for watching UCF in Print. I'm Alice Collier. Until next time, goodbye.